Hi guys, here's a quick carving demo. I'm going to use wax. Most of you are using soap, I think. So either one will work fine. I just happen to have a big bar of wax all ready for carving. I ordered some soap, but it's not going to get here till Wednesday, I guess. So here I am with my wax. I've got my setup here. I've got some clay tools. If you don't have clay tools, probably a paring knife is the best thing. I'm not sure what else you'll find in your kitchen or in your garage that you can use. Paring knife for most of the bulk carving, maybe something finer tipped like this little guy, this clay tool for doing some more finer work. These different types of loop tools are good for doing finer details, hard to reach spots. All right, so I'm going to quickly use my needle tool to draw on a design, and I'm going to do sort of a figure eight. So I'm going to start by drawing on, just sort of outlining the top of that circle, which is going to be that sort of figure eight. And one of the hardest things I've found with carving for first-time carvers is going from a square shape and understanding how much material needs to be removed to get down to a circular shape. Now it's going to be hard for you guys to see that with the contrast. And then I'm going to have the figure eight come on top down here, and then that'll become the inside of my circle at the bottom. So then this is going to come down, so my inside will come around like this and become the outside. And then this is going to come down, so it's going to be something like that. And so notice that I'm drawing that out where, I don't know if you can see, there, where one side is overlapping the other. So it goes in front of itself. And I'll try to line those up. You can see my first drawing, I'm not lining up the lines very well. So I want this to line up with that visually. So I'm going to scooch that over a little bit. So my bottom, you can kind of see, is a little bit flatter the way I've drawn it. The top is a little bit more rounded. Okay, so I'm going to start with that and just kind of outline that. So first thing I'm going to do is just carve away that top corner to get down to my circular shape. So if you're using a paring knife, you have to be sort of comfortable cutting towards your own thumb. I find this is actually the most effective way of carving wax or your soap. I'm going to first take down that corner. The trick with carving is you're trying to remove everything but the actual shape that you want, which is reverse from when you're building something out of clay. You're taking away all this negative space around the object. So you're kind of working in reverse. Sort of wrap your head around that. Some people it's just really intuitive and you get it right away, you understand the concept. And some people it takes doing it for a little while to fully understand how that actually works conceptually, and it just takes doing it a couple times before you understand it. There's the start of my top circle. That's getting close to the top circular shape that I want. Now I'm going to move down into the middle here, in between my parts of my figure eight, and so now I have to actually cut in and remove sort of this wedge shape. You can see I'm cutting away that middle part of the figure eight. And you do want to be careful with carving that you don't carve too much away. So like in here, I started to carve in just a little bit, and you can see how if I carved in too much, then that's removing material that I actually want for part of my, or potentially that I want for part of my finished form. So you got to be careful and go slowly with this, because the other thing that's different about carving from building with clay is if you once you've removed the material, you can't put it back on necessarily. Now, theoretically with wax, I can heat these shavings up and fill back in if I needed to. But you know, it's better to try not to have to do that. Same with soap. I guess potentially you could warm it up and try to fill in holes and crevices if you wanted to with your soap. So now you can see I've kind of carved away one side of that where it cuts in. I'm going to take off this bottom corner, start rounding out the bottom. So you have to find a way, obviously, that you feel comfortable working with this. You don't want to be cutting yourself. I'm always carving with a knife towards my own thumb, because you notice that if you're cutting like an apple or peeling a potato with a paring knife, it's very rare to actually cut yourself pushing straight on like that. But you can generally feel pretty comfortable drawing a knife straight towards your own thumb, and as long as you are careful with it, you should be pretty safe. So I'm just refining that bottom part of the curve there. So you can see it's starting to take a little bit of shape. I've cut pretty much one half of my figure eight done. And now I'll work on the other half. Okay, I'm back. I've pretty much roughed out the first front profile of my figure eight, and notice that I'm only working in one profile at this point. It's basically like a two-dimensional design. So the next step will be to look at it from the side view and start to figure out where the forms are going to cross each other. So that's where I drew this part coming in front, and then notice that this line stops and goes behind. Now I have to start thinking about how does that actually work three-dimensionally. So that's sort of the trick with carving, is you start out in one profile and then you turn and look at the other profile and then think about how those two profiles join together and become fully three-dimensional. This is the side here that's going to go behind, so I need to think about that coming around and going diagonally across the form to the back side so that there's space for it to come from the front to the back. So then this surface here, that's three-dimensional, it's not just a 2D line, is going to come across like that, and it's got some thickness to it. And when you start out carving, always leave yourself more material than you might think you'll need, and then you can always whittle it down and take it down smaller, but you don't want to take away too much to start with and then end up with not enough to finish your design. So I've got the thickness of it, and because it's a figure eight, it's going to stay pretty much the same thickness all the way across the form. So for me, a figure eight is sort of a good demo form to make because we all can sort of visualize it. Okay, so that's just a rough shape, and I'm going to start just removing the material now. So go back to my front profile that I drew, and you can see where those lines overlap. So I'm going to remove this material in here so that it has the ability to go behind this part that comes across in front. Be careful you don't slip and cut into your form or cut yourself, of course. So just to start hollowing that, I'll start that just a little bit like that. I don't know if you can see that. All right, so I'm going to cut in what I call a stop cut. So I know that my form, this is the part that comes forward, this is the part that goes behind. I know it's got to stop there, and so I'm going to cut right on that line, a nice stop cut. And that way, when I'm cutting this material away, it's much less likely that I'm going to slip and take away some of the material that I wanted to keep on the other part of that. So I'm going to now carve up to that stop cut, and as I go in, I'm going to keep cutting that stop cut in as well. So you can see I've started to remove the material in the front. Notice that I'm just working still in the flat profile of the front of this block. I'll work my way back because I want this to be a nice sort of directional spiral. And I can do a little more work on my hole, my negative space here now. I've removed some of that material. And you can start to see how this form is staying in front and this part of the form is starting to go behind or underneath, right? I don't know if you can see that with the contrast. And so now I need to work on the other side Do the same thing over here where this is going to dive down and it's going to match up with that side. So again, I'm going to do my stop cut first. This time I haven't done any of my negative space. I'll have to do that as well. Use this guy again. Start rounding out that negative space. Okay, so here's kind of the roughed out shape from the front, and you can see I've actually drilled my holes all the way through, and I just use my fettling knife. Be careful if you're drilling a hole. This bottom one I started to go a little bit too far off to the side. It'll still be fine. Make sure that you're going straight through. You can see I've roughed out the directional movement that I want, where this is the highest point in the front, curves around, dives behind. It doesn't go as far in yet as it will eventually, but I just wanted to get the shape roughed out. And now I'm going to turn it around and work on the back side. The back side, I've drawn in my division between the top part and the part that dives behind, just like I did in the front, but it's in the opposite direction. So again, I'm going to first carve my stop cut and then cut up to it. And start removing that material so that it starts to look like a twisting form overlapping itself. So I like a spiral figure eight because it has such a nice sense of movement front to back. It creates a sense of rhythm, which is one of the principles of design that I want you to consider. It's also a dynamic form, which is in your handout is one of the things you're trying to achieve with this, is create a sense of movement to the form. And then I also want you to try to remove the sense of the original faces of the block being present. That's another nice thing about the figure eight, is it won't have any square edges from the original block. Okay, so you can start to see where the form is overlapping front to back and twisting around itself. Now this is still very blocky, so the final step will be sort of final shaping of everything, right? So it's still a little too thick, so I'll need to take down some of the volume, and then I'll need to start rounding it out. Now I could leave a sharp contour to contrast everything else being rounded or organic. Okay, so I've just been working on this. You can see form is still pretty rough. You can see my lines don't flow super smoothly yet. The line is a little bit herky-jerky the way it curves, but I have it pretty well blocked out. When the inside of the form starts to separate, then you need to start working on the inside of that form. So that's a good point to start actually carving in a little contour or a little groove where the two forms overlap, and then you're creating sort of the space in between. I don't know if you can see that with the contrast, but I've started to create a little bit of a groove there, which starts to separate the forms. So same thing over here, right? Because I want this to feel like it's actually going in front of that, or vice versa. And so I can work from all directions and create that little bit of a separation line. And I can carve that in just a little bit. I'm not going to actually fully separate these two parts of the form. I'm going to leave them connected to each other, but I want to create the feeling that one is going in front of the other. And so I want to create that little bit of a space between them so that it looks like they're separate. So now I'm going to start shaping and rounding my form. So you can see like this edge is not very straight yet. It doesn't flow very nicely. So I do want to work a little bit on making that so it's not as wavy, so it actually evens out. So I'll just start taking off my corner. And I want to do this slowly because I don't want to take off too much material. But just as I took off the top corner at the beginning, now I'm going to start working my way around. And you can do this either by slicing or by scraping. And if you remember back at the beginning of the semester with the clay, we talked about using a scraper tool to even out a surface. Because a fettling knife is such a straight edge, I can use that going back and forth at different angles to even out the surface and get rid of all the little indents, because when I'm slicing, it's hard to control the knife moving through the material. It tends to dig in a little bit too much, and it creates little grooves and chatter marks where the tool isn't flowing very well. And so you can scrape to even that out and go back and forth at different angles. It'll get rid of all of those little indents and it'll even out the surface, make it more of a consistent flowing surface. So you can see already this surface is starting to take a little bit more shape. It's starting to flow a little bit better than it was. It doesn't have as wavy of a direction of the line. So when I start rounding this out, taking off the corners, that of course is this outer form is gonna become the inner form where they meet in the middle. And so that's going to heighten my groove where the forms actually overlap or touch each other. And so I'm gonna have to continue that through where they overlap. So I'm working back and forth in different directions, again, because I had that slightly wavy line. I want to try to get rid of all the high spots and smooth it out. Never try to go over too much in the same direction with your tool. So if I do all my carving with my tool straight, I'm going to end up creating more little gouges and ridges. So if I am sort of constantly shifting different angles of my tool, then the tool is forced to go over the top and get rid of those little ridges and smooth them out. So continue taking off my corner here. And this is my original face of my block still. So I'm going to bring that down because it's kind of a little bit too flat. I'm going to start bringing that around. And the idea is that eventually you don't have a front or back anymore because everything blends together. All the different surfaces blend together and become a nice rounded surface. And you start losing a sense of where the original front, back, or sides of your block were. And everything starts coming together. And that's the real mark of a dynamic form, is when you lose any sense of where the front, back, or sides of the form are. Where it's kind of equal or interesting from all angles. Now I still have this, here's one of my faces of my block still pretty strongly present. So I'm going to keep removing that corner and round that out. So you start to see this side is getting kind of rounded. I don't know if you can see that again with the contrast. It's definitely different carving a translucent surface like this. I'm used to carving plaster, which is the solid white, and you can really see the surface. Whereas this, because it's so translucent, depending on the angle the light hits it at, kind of disappears. Okay, so this is where my separate chunks of wax are really causing me trouble here. That part is keeps chipping away. You've got the inside of your form, of course. You want to keep rounding that out, so you can use sort of the tip of your knife. Just bring that around. Constantly changing the angle and the direction of your cuts so that it's following the flow of the form. So you start to see the form taking shape, right? Oops. See, I haven't done anything on the back side yet. It's still very square and it's a little too thick in spots, a little too wide. So I'll continue to work on that and I'll do the rest of the demo live on Monday. All right, so there's the start of our carving project.